thoughts, because since this incident with Sudha Shaman occurred there in the UK, there has been concern, right, about this, and some of it does seem very legitimate, doesn't it? That you don't want to just release people without knowing if they've been de-radicalized in some fashion or other. I mean, if this person is prone to violence again, why even release them early?
Certainly, and that's a genuine concern. It's not something to be sniffed at. But again, when it comes to legislation, the devil is in the detail. So they talk about trying to stop automatic release. Judges already have that power when it comes to these crimes, and really there isn't that much detail on what they're proposing. So at the moment, what we do know is that they're trying to push the minimum required of a sentence to 2/3 as opposed to a half. That's not going to deal with the actual problems of when they are released to society. There has been certain statements of trying to use lie detectors and other sort of novel ways that are really not accurate in trying to determine someone's behavior or intention. So really the government has been accused by large sections of the media, including organizations like ourselves, of using this as a PR stunt as opposed to seriously dealing with this issue. And this is in a background where there has been, way before the last general election, it's been reported massive cuts in our prisons in terms of funding, in terms of staff, massive cuts in terms of policing. And there has been many cases where these individuals, they have been released, and it's been found out that actually the security services knew about them. In some of those cases, their own family members have reported them to those authorities, and nothing was happened. So in that situation, you only really have two scenarios: either these people are left to their own devices deliberately, or there's a massive problem, a significant problem of underfunding, and these measures don't solve that at all.
All right, so then, Francis, I wonder, as I'd mentioned in my introduction as well, there is that issue of de-radicalization as well, right? And even Boris Johnson has mentioned that this is a challenge at this point in time. How do you think, or what do you think, sensible legislation in that regard should look like?
Well, the difficulty the government perceives in this is that for most offences that were sentenced before this year, because I believe the government is introducing legislation to change certain offences so that release is automatic only after 2/3 of the sentence. Currently, for most offences, release date is automatic at half the sentence, and that's read out by the judge in court and is known to the prisoner, which is one of the objections to this. It's not actually right that, as was suggested just now, that the judges have any power to change that. They don't, nor does the parole board. So I suppose the government's take on this will be that the parole board has no intervention and has no ability to say that a person who is imprisoned for a standard offence, and standard could be very serious, it could be anything up to any sentence that is short of life imprisonment that has a standard prison term, will have an automatic release date, whereas those prisoners who are sentenced to life imprisonment will have a tariff, and that's their minimum sentence. And then after that tariff is reached, which might be, say, 10 or 15 years for murder, it's typically 15 years upwards, then the parole board will have to assess whether they are safe to be released, and it will have all sorts of measures to determine that. They're not obviously infallible, and sometimes prisoners offend again, and there's no way of preventing that. But the government would say that in certain cases, wider than simply where people are in prison for life imprisonment, the parole board needs to have some form of means of preventing release. Now, that would only under the legislation.
Franz, if I may come in for a moment, and I wanted to ask you a very direct question. I want to put you on the spot, but I will ask you this nevertheless. Do you think that there is, in some ways, especially after this latest terror incident there in the UK, that there's almost this biased approach to, as I said, Islamist, jihadist, whatever you want to term that form of terrorism? Do you think that there's almost this bias that is the only form at this point in time of terrorism which needs to be tackled in this specific fashion, where you just, you cancel out early release altogether? Or do you think that that parole board judges or whoever is sitting on those parole boards, that they are going to be really doing this in a fair fashion? Because again, as you mentioned, they're not infallible in any way, either way, really. But do you think that in some ways that this will bring in a double-tiered approach, which many are saying is a concern now?
Well, there's two possible meanings of bias here. Firstly is whether or not the government and parliament and perhaps the media and the wider population are biased against particular types of offenders and perhaps whether there's some form of Islamophobia there. That may or may not be. It's probably right to say that the terrorist incidents now are disproportionately Islamist terrorist offences. The statistics would tend to support that. In 20 or 30 years ago, terrorism from Northern Ireland, both loyalist and Republican, was prevalent. These things go in waves, and that is how it is. The second question, and so that's an open question. The second question, though, is whether or not judges and parole boards are biased. A more important question, because of course they determine the individual parameters, the sentences, and whether or not people are released. There's no evidence to suggest that there is sustained bias there, and strong evidence to suggest that offenders are sentenced in an impartial fashion. Those sentences are subject to appeal. If there's any incidence of bias, you would hope that that would be corrected by the Court of Appeal, or in very rare instances.
I'm going to cut you off, Francis, just because we're running out of time. I do apologize. I just want Imran the final word. Imran, tell us about the concerns on the part of the Muslim community in the UK when it comes to, and I know you've already laid out a bit of that for us, but will this bring in a double-tiered approach, as many are saying is the main concern right now?
I mean, there is a lot of fear and concern in regards to this. Already last month, The Guardian reported that Muslims convicted of even small crimes of extremism, like online offences, are given sentences 3 times longer than their white equivalent. So there's already bias. As of 2 years ago, the UK terror chief has said that the biggest threat is not Islamic extremism, is actually far-right extremism, and that is across society. And again, that reflects in terms of the political precedents. You have a number of Muslim groups that are extreme, have been subscribed, but when you look at Britain First, EDL, and others, these are heavily extremist, heavily sort of Islamophobic, and they are promoting violence. And so you have those ideas essentially allowed to ferment in society. The government's not shutting them down, and some would argue actually their ideas are prevailing in the press and even in the highest levels of government. So there is a massive fear in regards to a two-tier system, and there's already evidence for that inside the justice system and outside of it.
Very well. We'll leave there.